Thousands of men marched toward battle, but most of them were already doomed and didn't know it. A proud king, a patient enemy, and a betrayal that would change the fate of an entire kingdom. Because this isn't just a war story, it's the story of how an empire slowly started dying from the inside. And the worst part, the signs were there from the very beginning. The kingdom hadn't known defeat for decades. Its walls were high, its armies massive, and its king convinced nothing could bring him down. His name was Alaric, a ruler forged in war, hardened by constant victory, and surrounded by men who never dared to question him. And that was the first problem. There were no enemies inside the kingdom, but there was also no one willing to challenge him. And when a leader stops being questioned, mistakes begin to grow. At first small ones, rushed decisions, unnecessary punishments, blind trust in the wrong people. But no one spoke up, because as long as the kingdom kept winning, no one saw the danger, until the first warning arrived. A messenger covered in mud reached the gates one night. News from the north. An army was moving. Not large, not organized, but something was off. They weren't raiding villages. They weren't leaving a trace. They were simply advancing. Some men felt uneasy, but not the king. Alaric laughed it off. Just another minor threat. Just another enemy that would fall like the rest. So he ordered the army to prepare. Fast. No strategy. No discussion. Because in his mind the war was already won. But this time, the enemy was playing a different game. Unlike Alaric, the enemy commander never underestimated his opponent. Nobody really knew his name. He didn't want fame. He didn't want glory. Only one thing: victory. For weeks his army moved in silence, watching, measuring, waiting. They knew the king would react fast. They knew he would attack without thinking. And that was exactly what they needed. Because they had studied everything. The kingdom's roots, its response times, its weaknesses, and above all its king. Proud, impulsive, predictable. And when you know your enemy better than they know themselves, the battle is already half decided. Meanwhile, inside the castle, Alaric gathered his generals, not to listen, but to confirm what he had already decided. Strike first, strike fast, and crush the enemy before they could react. Some hesitated. Almost no one spoke. And those who did quickly fell silent, because questioning the king was becoming dangerous. And that was the second mistake. It wasn't bad strategy that doomed the kingdom. It was silence. The silence of those who knew something was wrong, but said nothing. And so the army marched at dawn. Thousands of men, thinking they would return as heroes. Not knowing many of them would never return at all, because the enemy had already chosen the battlefield, and it wasn't open ground. It was a trap. And when the royal army entered that valley, it was already too late. The valley was narrow, too narrow, rocky cliffs on both sides, fog sinking low across the ground. But the army kept moving. No one expected resistance here. And that was the third mistake. At first nothing happened. Only footsteps. Metal clashing softly. dust rising under thousands of boots. Then it started. A whistle. Then another. And then hundreds. Arrows. Falling from the cliffs above. No warning. No time to react. Men dropped instantly, confused. Chaos spread fast. Shields raised too late. Orders drowned out. Formation collapsing. Above them the enemy watched. No shouting. No rushing. Just precision. Every move calculated. Every hour intentional. Down below, King Alaric tried to reorganize his forces. But it was already gone. Because once an army loses formation, it loses control. And once it loses control, it starts to die. Then came the second phase. Enemy soldiers appeared at both ends of the valley, blocking every exit. The trap was complete. No advance. No retreat. Only one option. Survive. But the real problem wasn't outside. It was inside. In the middle of chaos. One of the king's generals wasn't fighting. He was watching. His name was Darius. And he had been waiting for this moment. Because he was never loyal to the king. Not once. He had watched Alaric change. Grow arrogant. Ignore advice. Punished out. And he made a decision. If the king wouldn't fall by mistake, he would fall by betrayal. Darius had already made contact with the enemy. Information in exchange for power. A quiet deal. Dirty. But effective. And now it was time to deliver. While men were dying in the valley, Darius gave the order. Retreat. But not a controlled one. A panic retreat. His troops started pulling back, pushing others, breaking formations even further, spreading chaos inside chaos. And that was it. Because fear spreads faster than anything else. Within minutes, an army became a collapsing mass. Alaric saw it. He didn't understand. He tried to restore order, but no one listened anymore. Because once men believe everything is lost, they stop obeying, and they run. And as everything fell apart, Darius simply disappeared, leaving the king behind, leaving the army behind, leaving everything behind. And in that moment, the fate of the kingdom was sealed. The sun barely broke through the fog, but it was enough. Bodies. Hundreds. Maybe thousands. The valley was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard. Those still fighting were fighting without hope. No orders. No structure. Just instinct. Alaric still stood, covered in mud, blood, defeat. For the first time, he had no control, and no answer. And that changed everything. Because a king can lose battles, he can lose men. But when he loses clarity, he loses everything. The enemy descended from the cliffs. Now they finished it. Slowly. Calmly. They already knew they had won. Each step another ending. Each strike another life erased. Alaric tried to escape. There was nowhere left. Only enemies. And then he understood. Too late. He wasn't defeated by a stronger army. He was defeated by his own mistakes. His pride. His blindness. his trust in the wrong people. When he finally fell to his knees, the battle was already gone. Only silence remained. Heavy. Final. The king who never lost had fallen. But this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something far worse. Because when a kingdom loses its king, it doesn't just lose a ruler. It loses its stability. And someone was already ready to take advantage of that. The news didn't arrive immediately. For hours the kingdom didn't know. Life continued. Markets open. Gates open. Normal days. As if nothing had happened. Until the survivors arrived. Wounded. Covered in blood. Broken. And with them the truth. The king was dead. The army destroyed. And the enemy still advancing. Fear spread instantly. Because it's one thing to fear an enemy. It's another to realize no one is left to protect you. Inside the castle, nobles gathered. Not to plan, but to argue, to blame, to protect themselves. Because without a king there is no authority. And without authority everyone fights for themselves. Some wanted resistance. Some wanted negotiation. Some were already preparing to flee. But while they argue, the real danger was already moving. The enemy wasn't rushing. It was waiting. Waiting for the kingdom to break itself. And it already had. Without a king, there was only one question. Who rules now? And there was no answer. Three forces emerged. A war veteran, a political negotiator, and Darius, the traitor. He returned, not as a fugitive, but as a savior. And he told a story, that the battle was lost from the start, that he tried to save who he could, that the king had doomed them all, and people believed him. Because in chaos, people don't seek truth, they seek comfort, and Darius knew exactly how to give it. He gained influence, not because he was right, but because he was convincing. And while others debated, he took control quietly, silently, and almost no one noticed. Except one person, a young captain, a survivor of the valley. He had seen too much, and something didn't add up. Not at all. And without realizing it, he had just identified the real enemy. Inside the kingdom, the enemy still hadn't attacked. And that was the most dangerous part. Because it meant one thing. They were waiting. Inside the kingdom tension rose. Rumors spread. Trust disappeared. No one knew who to believe anymore. And Darius moved freely, placing his people in key positions. Guard posts, messengers, advisors. No force, just infiltration, slow control. And that is always the most dangerous kind. Because when power is taken slowly, no one notices until it's too late. Meanwhile, the captain started investigating, and the truth began to form. The retreat had not been an accident. It had been ordered, and only one man could have done it. Darius. But accusing him would be suicide. And so a new war began. Not with armies, not with battles, but with information, manipulation, power. A war you don't see coming, until you've already lost. The capital didn't collapse instantly. That's not how kingdoms die. They break slowly in layers. At first it was subtle. A delay in messengers. A guard refusing to answer questions directly. A noble who stopped attending council meetings. Small things. Almost invisible. But in a system built on trust. Small cracks are the beginning of collapse. And inside those cracks Darius was working. Not loudly. Not aggressively. But strategically. He didn't need force. He needed dependency. So he started controlling information flow. Messages were verified before delivery. Reports were corrected before reaching the council. And slowly reality started to shift. Not by changing events, but by changing how they were seen. And that is far more powerful. Because a kingdom doesn't react to truth. It reacts to what it believes is true. Meanwhile, something else was happening. A few officers who survived the valley began meeting in secret. Not to rebel yet, but to compare memories. And what they discovered unsettled them. Because their experiences didn't match the official version. At all. And once that kind of doubt appears, it doesn't disappear. It grows. The young captain understood something very quickly. Speaking publicly was useless. The system was already controlled. So he stopped trying to convince people directly. Instead he studied the structure. Who reports to who? Who delivers messages? Who controls access to decisions? Because power is never just one person. It is a network. And networks can be mapped. So he began building something dangerous. Not an army. Not yet. A structure of trust. Small groups. Independent cells. No central leader exposed. Just fragments of truth spread carefully. And the more he observed Darius, the more he understood the real danger. Darius wasn't improvising. He was building something long-term. A controlled state. Where rebellion wouldn't even be possible. And that meant one thing. They were running out of time. Darius noticed the change. He always did. But this time he didn't react immediately. That was unusual. Instead he observed. Because Darius didn't fear resistance. He studied it. And what he saw concerned him. Information was leaking again. Small inconsistencies spreading. Uncontrolled narratives forming. So he shifted strategy. From control to elimination of uncertainty. He didn't need to know everything. He just needed people to stop trusting everything. And fear is perfect for that. So arrests increased. But more importantly, uncertainty increased even more. People stopped asking, what is true? And started asking, what is safe to believe? And in that moment, truth stopped mattering. The first crack didn't come from a sword. It came from paper. A single document. A fragment of orders that was never meant to leave controlled hands. It didn't reveal everything. That would have been too easy. Instead, it revealed just enough. A contradiction in the official story of the valley. A movement order that didn't match battlefield logic. And that was enough. Because doubt doesn't need proof. It only needs inconsistency. The scribes noticed it first. They were trained to see patterns in words, not politics. And what they saw was disturbing. The retreat had timing signatures. structured coordination, not chaos, not panic, intentional sequencing. Someone had planned it, and that realization spread quietly, from scribe to clerk, from clerk to guard, from guard to minor noble, not openly, but dangerously, because once truth starts leaking through unofficial channels, it becomes uncontrollable, and Darius didn't know it yet, but control was starting to slip through his fingers. The capital didn't explode. It fractured. Slowly. Invisible at first. Two versions of reality began forming. Official reality, stability, security, control. Unspoken reality, manipulation, fear, disappearance. People started living in both. Speaking carefully in public, whispering freely in private. That duality is dangerous for any regime, because it creates cognitive tension, and cognitive tension demands resolution. Inside the palace, Darius tightened measures. But tightening control has a cost. Every restriction creates resistance pressure, like compressing a spring. The more you push down, the harder it eventually pushes back. And that pressure was building. Fast. The young captain stopped trying to act like a leader. That was the mistake of most rebellions. Visibility. So instead he became invisible. He worked through intermediaries. Each person only knew a small piece. No one saw the full structure. Not even him entirely. It wasn't trust. It was compartmentalization. And it worked. Soldiers who had lost faith in Darius began coordinating quietly. Not for immediate uprising, but for preparation. Mapping guard rotations. Tracking supply routes. Identifying loyalist strongholds. And something unexpected happened. Hope returned. Not loudly. Not emotionally. Structurally. Which is far more dangerous for a regime. Because hope organized becomes action. Darius didn't react with mass violence immediately. That would have been inefficient. Instead, he tested. Small arrests. Targeted disappearances. Selective intimidation. He was measuring something. How much resistance existed and where. But what he didn't realize was that he was also revealing his own system's limits. Because every action required trust in subordinates. And trust was beginning to erode. Some guards hesitated before executing orders. Some delayed reports. Some began asking questions. Not rebellion, just hesitation. And hesitation is the first form of disobedience. While the kingdom destabilized internally, the external enemy stopped expanding slowly and started consolidating. They weren't rushing. They were building permanence, fortified positions, controlled trade routes, cut supply dependencies. They weren't just invading anymore. They were replacing structure. And that was worse. Because invasion can be resisted, replacement cannot. Inside the capital, few understood this. Most still believed the main threat was internal politics. They were wrong. The collapse was now happening on two fronts. And they were connected. Someone tried to remove Darius. Quietly. A blade in the dark. But Darius was not careless. He expected resistance. And that expectation saved him. The assassin was captured. Not killed immediately. Interrogated. And that was the mistake. Because information extracted under pressure is never just about one person. It reveals networks, connections, patterns. And within hours, Darius had names. Not all, but enough. And that gave him justification, not just to strike back, but to escalate completely. This time, there were no warnings. Entire sectors of the city were sealed overnight. People disappeared without record. Families split apart in silence. And publicly, Darius justified it as stability enforcement. And people believed it. Not because it was convincing, but because alternatives were dangerous to believe. Fear doesn't need logic. It only needs consequences. But something changed this time. The population didn't become more obedient. It became quieter. And quiet populations are not always controlled. Sometimes they are preparing. The enemy finally appeared at the horizon of the capital's sphere of influence. Not attacking, just present. Like a reminder. And for the first time, the citizens understood something simple. There was no longer a faraway war. It was here. But Darius refrained it immediately. He didn't deny it. He redirected it. He claimed internal stability was the only thing preventing annihilation. And it worked. For now. Because external fear often strengthens internal control. But only temporarily. It was not an accident. It was timing. The network was exposed at a weak point. A meeting disrupted. A pattern detected. And suddenly, the captain was no longer free. He was taken. Quietly. Efficiently. And brought directly to Darius. No crowd. No trial. Just confrontation. And now everything depended on one thing. Whether he could hold the system together under pressure, or finally break it. The captain didn't resist. Not at first. Because resisting in that moment meant dying immediately and losing the only advantage he still had: time. They took him through corridors he knew. That was the most unsettling part. This wasn't a random arrest. It was precise. Intentional. Someone had traced his network. Not fully, but enough. And that enough was dangerous. Inside the holding chambers, there was no ceremony, no audience, just silence. And Darius, waiting, not angry, not rushed, calm, which was worse. Because anger is predictable. Calm is controlled. Darius didn't start with accusations. He started with understanding. He spoke like someone who already knew the answers and was simply checking if the captain would confirm them. That psychological shift mattered. He wasn't interrogating a prisoner. He was dismantling a structure, piece by piece. And then he asked the question that changed the tone completely. How many are there? Not are there others, but how many? Assuming the system already existed. And in that moment the captain understood something. Darius didn't just suspect the resistance. He had already mapped parts of it. Not all, but enough to be dangerous. The interrogation didn't rely on pain. It relied on certainty. Darius never raised his voice. He didn't need to. He presented fragments of truth. Partial confirmations. Names that should not have been known. And then he waited. Because people don't break from pressure. They break from the feeling that resistance is already useless. Outside the chamber, the kingdom continued collapsing in layers. But inside, something else was happening. The captain wasn't only defending himself. He was protecting the network. Every answer mattered. Every hesitation mattered. Every silence mattered. Because information wasn't just information anymore. It was survival. But Darius was patient. And patience is a weapon most people underestimate. He shifted strategy. Instead of forcing answers, he offered alternatives. Survival in exchange for cooperation. Not freedom, just survival. And that was the real danger. Because when the enemy stops demanding truth and starts offering safety, resistance becomes negotiable. While the interrogation continued, the outer defenses of the capital were tested, not fully attacked. Probed. Measured. The enemy was studying response times, weak points, command delays, and what they found confirmed everything. The kingdom no longer reacted as a unified system. It reacted as fragments. Some units responded. Others hesitated. Some didn't respond at all. That inconsistency was fatal, because coordinated defense requires trust. And trust was gone. Inside the capital, Darius received reports. But even he noticed something subtle. His control wasn't total anymore. Messages were slower. Interpretations were shifting. Orders were questioned before execution. The system wasn't collapsing. It was fragmenting into semi-independent behaviors. Which meant one thing. Central authority was weakening. Even his. And that realization forced a decision. Escalate again, or risk losing control entirely. Back in the chamber, Darius changed tone completely. This wasn't interrogation anymore. It was negotiation. He leaned forward. Calm. Controlled. And he offered something unexpected. Not freedom. Not mercy. But structure. A role inside the new order. A place for the captain in the system Darius was building. Because Darius had already stopped thinking about saving the kingdom. He was thinking about what comes after collapse. And in his mind, collapse was no longer avoidable. Only manageable. The captain listened. Not because he was considering it, but because he needed time. And Darius knew that too. Which is why he added one final layer. If you refuse, they won't ask again. No threat of pain. Just replacement. Because systems don't need individuals. They only need functions. And that was the real philosophy behind Darius' power. Replaceability. But the captain understood something deeper. If Darius was offering integration instead of elimination, it meant the resistance had already become a real threat. And outside, something was shifting again. The enemy was no longer waiting. They were preparing movement. A synchronized advance, timed with internal collapse. The captain didn't answer immediately. Not because he was confused, but because he understood the weight of what was being offered. Darius wasn't trying to convince him anymore. He was redefining reality. Inside his system, there were no rebels. Only useful and obsolete. And that was the real threat. Because once people are classified instead of judged, they stop being individuals. They become components. The captain finally spoke. Not a refusal, not an acceptance. A delay. And that was enough. Because in Darius' world, hesitation already meant classification. Outside the chamber, something shifted. Messages were intercepted. A second layer of the resistance network activated. Not planned. Not coordinated. Triggered. Because the capture of the captain wasn't just an event. It was a signal. And signals travel fast when systems are already unstable. The resistance didn't explode. It synchronized. That was the difference. Small cells that had been isolated for weeks suddenly started moving at the same time. Not attacking. Positioning. Guard rotations were observed. Supply chains mapped. Key corridors identified. And for the first time, Darius' system was being studied in reverse. But there was a problem. They still didn't have confirmation of leadership survival. The captain was still missing. And without him, coordination risked collapse. Inside the palace, Darius noticed unusual movement patterns. Not enough to fully decode, but enough to feel it. And that feeling changed his approach completely. He stopped expanding control and started consolidating it, which meant something simple. He was preparing for war inside the capital, not metaphorically, literally. It started at night, not with a declaration, with silence breaking. A guard post failed to report. Then another. Then a communication line went dead. And within minutes, 3 controlled sectors of the city stopped responding to palace commands. Not rebellion in the streets. Rebellion in the system. Infrastructure denial. Information disruption. Controlled paralysis. Darius understood immediately. This wasn't chaos. It was design. And that meant the resistance had evolved. They were no longer reacting to him. They were anticipating him. He ordered immediate lockdown protocols. But something unexpected happened. Some orders were ignored. Not rejected. Just not executed. And that distinction mattered. Because rejection is resistance. But non-execution is erosion. And systems can survive resistance. But they collapse under erosion. By morning, the capital was no longer unified. It was partitioned. Physically controlled by Darius in the center, but operationally fragmented around it. Some districts obeyed. Others didn't respond at all. Some actively misled palace commands. And now both sides understood something unavoidable. This was no longer hidden conflict. It was open structural breakdown. Darius gathered his remaining loyal commanders. But the tone had changed. They weren't confident anymore. They were uncertain. And uncertainty in leadership spreads faster than orders. Meanwhile, the resistance made its first coordinated move. Not an attack on the palace. A liberation of information nodes. Communication hubs were seized. Signal relays reprogrammed. False orders injected into loyalist channels. And suddenly, Darius wasn't controlling the city anymore. He was reacting to it. For the first time since the valley, he was losing initiative. And he knew exactly what that meant. If he didn't regain control quickly, the capital wouldn't just fall into chaos. It would split permanently. And outside the walls, the enemy began to move. Not slowly this time. In formation. Darius didn't wait for confirmation anymore. That was the shift. For the first time since the valley, he stopped reacting to events and started forcing them. The capital went into full lockdown. Not defensive. Controlled. Every gate sealed. Every district assigned. Every communication channel centralized. On paper, it looked like stability. In reality, it was compression. And compressed systems don't stay stable for long. They explode. Inside the resistance network, the pressure peaked. Some wanted immediate uprising. Others wanted to hold position. But there was no longer time for disagreement. Because Darius made his final assumption. If he couldn't fully control the city, he would reset it. And that meant elimination of all fractured zones. System purge. Targeted collapse of uncontrolled districts. Not war in the traditional sense. Resetting order through destruction. And the first orders went out that night. But something unexpected happened. They weren't fully executed. Not refused. Not delayed. Ignored. Entire units stopped responding. And that was the moment Darius realized something critical. His system no longer had loyalty. It had inertia. And inertia cannot be commanded. Only redirected. Outside the palace, the resistance activated fully. This time not hiding. Coordinated movement across sectors. The capital wasn't splitting anymore. It was reorganizing itself against him. And then came the worst report. The outer enemy had begun their final march. No hesitation. No probing. Full advance toward the capital walls. 2 collapses. Inside and outside. Converging at the same point. And Darius understood what was coming. Not defeat. Convergence. The city didn't fall all at once. It unraveled in layers. First, the outer districts. Then the central routes. Then the palace perimeter. Each collapse feeding the next. The resistance didn't celebrate. They couldn't. There was no victory moment. Only function. They were trying to prevent total annihilation, not win a war. Inside the palace, Darius finally moved personally. Not as a strategist. Not as a controller. As a participant. He understood that control had failed. Now only direct confrontation remained. He reached the central command hall, and there he saw the final truth of his system. It wasn't stable. It was sustained. By fear. By structure. By belief in inevitability. And all 3 had broken. The captain was there. Not alone. But no longer hidden. The resistance had converged too. For a moment nothing moved. Because this wasn't just a confrontation. It was the end of 3 systems at once. Darius spoke first. Not to plead, but to explain. Because in his mind he still believed order could be understood. Rebuilt. Rebalanced. But the captain interrupted him. Not with anger. With clarity. The kind that comes after too much loss. He didn't accuse him. He didn't argue ideology. He simply stated what had already happened. The kingdom didn't fall because of the enemy. It fell because it stopped trusting itself. And that was the final fracture. Outside the hall the walls broke. The enemy entered the capital. No resistance remained organized enough to stop them. But they didn't find a kingdom. They found fragments, competing systems, collapsed authority. And inside the palace, Darius stood still for the first time, not in control, not planning, just aware that everything he built had worked until it didn't, and that is how kingdoms end, not in a moment, but in sequence. Alaric had fallen in the valley. Darius had taken what remained. The resistance tried to repair it. The enemy finished it. But the truth stayed the same. The kingdom didn't die from invasion. It died from internal erosion, from silence, from pride, from control without trust. And when everything was finally over, there was no throne left, no ruler, no system, only consequences, and a question that would remain long after the ashes settle. Who destroys a kingdom faster? Its enemies, or the people trying to control it?